Katerina on AM 560, The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Trump's press avail at the White House yesterday. Reporter asked about this story that was circulating that J.D. Vance was convening a select group to discuss how to deal with the Epstein files, and the president was queried about that. He then turned it over to J.D. Vance, and this is what the two had to say side by side.
I saw a report today, and it's completely fake news. We're not meeting to talk about the Epstein situation, and I think the reporter who reported it needs to get better sources.
Look, the whole thing is a hoax. It's put out by the Democrats because we've had the most successful 6 months in the history of our country, and that's just a way of trying to divert attention to something that's total bullshit. Okay?
On that subject.
Okay. Well, I mean, that is the position that investigative journalist Lee Smith took in his piece I mentioned earlier this week, that that Epstein Gate is Russiagate 2.0. Let me just read you his concluding paragraphs on this. I mean, he addresses the suggestion made by Tucker Carlson and others that Epstein was potentially a Mossad agent and all that stuff. But let me just get to the crux of this. No surprise. It is no surprise the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton's mishandling of classified information concluded she did nothing wrong, even though the FBI had evidence that her private server was likely hacked by the Russians. What would later shock Trump and his supporters was the discovery that at the exact same time the director of the FBI cleared her, the FBI also set in motion an operation to frame the Republican candidate for stealing and leaking her emails by tying him to Russia. The only evidence for the allegation that he was compromised by Moscow, an allegation the FBI used to spy on the Trump campaign, was fabricated by Clinton contractors. Right, we know this, but it's good to refresh our recollection of what the summary understanding should be. Lee Smith goes on, for a quarter century, the FBI has been protecting the Clintons. That's a statement. The idea that this same law enforcement agency exposed the Clintons and some of their most prominent donors in Epstein's circle, such as Bill Gates and Leslie Wexner, to a blackmail operation run by a foreign intelligence service, let alone Israel's, is untethered from reality. The idea that Trump has buried the Epstein story and is thereby protecting the individuals and institutions that sought to ruin him is deranged. Well, okay. I mean, that's one argument, but if that is true, if what Lee Smith is arguing, which it may be, then it would have been helpful if Trump and/or Bondi and/or Trump and Bondi and Cash laid this all out rather than issuing this unsigned memo from the DOJ saying this is all there is and that's all we have to say about it. We're moving on. And just making, and then the president just sort of making generic characterizations of it as a hoax. After all the run-up, some of it, a significant amount of it, instigated by Trump and Cash and Bongino and Bondi, that wasn't the way to handle it if there's no there, as Lee Smith argues. But, I mean, so there's so much to unpack. That's part of it. And the other piece of it, though, which is I would love a lot more detail on, and maybe Cash and Bongino can get to providing some of the evidentiary support for the statement Lee Smith makes, which is for a quarter of a century, the FBI has been protecting the Clintons. It wasn't just Hillary and her server. Hillary and her manufactured bogus Russian collusion Steele dossier documents. For more on this, please be joined by Thomas Baker, retired FBI special agent and legal attaché, author of The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Thomas Baker, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you this morning, Don.
Well, so I mean, how a once great agency became a threat to democracy. I think we're trying to pinpoint when exactly that moment occurred, because it seems to be going further and further back in time with the more information that's revealed.
Well, you're right. And in the book, that's bothered me and bothered a lot of other people who had been in the FBI to try. When did it go off track? And I basically concluded that it's a cultural change in the mindset, changing from a law enforcement agency to an intelligence agency, or as Mueller and then Comey like to call it, an intelligence-driven agency. And I think the one precise moment, was way back on the Saturday, September 15th, right after the September 11th attacks, when Mueller, and I recount this in the book, and Mueller's told me this personally and told other people this numerous times, when he was called to Camp David by President George W. Bush, he thought to give a report on the attack. Now, in the 3.5 days between the attack on Tuesday, September 11th, and that Saturday morning meeting at Camp David, where President George W. Bush was hunkered down with Condoleezza Rice and all his other top advisors, Mueller stood up and gave the FBI report. And he had a reason to be proud, because in 3.5 days, the FBI had done what it does best: investigate. And they had found out who all the 19 hijackers were, their travel pattern, their connections, their financing, all their rental cars they had used, everything about them, and all their connections going back to al-Qaeda. Well, when he was done with this presentation, expecting praise or thanks, instead, President George W. Bush just dismissed him and said, "I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." Later that morning, George Tenet, the head of the CIA, gave a presentation looking forward to some proactive things he was contemplating. And when he was finished, according to many people there, George W. Bush said, "That's great." And he turned and looked at Mueller and he said, "That's what I want to hear." Mueller has said on numerous occasions that after that meeting, he was bound and determined to change the culture of the FBI, to do away with its law enforcement mindset and get it to think like an intelligence agency. Now, that might have seemed justified at the time, but it had unintended consequences. A law enforcement agency deals in facts. An intelligence agency deals in estimates. And that's where I think it began to get off the track under Mueller and then under Comey, certainly. And it became very free-wielding, and we saw that in the Russian collusion investigation.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's that watershed moment that you're describing. I mean, that does make some sense. So then, what happened to Mueller over the intervening 15 years, up until the point that he headed this Russiagate investigation and really sort of compromised himself and then sort of pathetically exposed himself as maybe not being up for the job in the first place?
Yeah, well, yes, there's several steps in there. You're absolutely right. First of all, Obama really liked him, and Obama kept him on. There was a statute, a law had been passed, so we would never have another J. Edgar Hoover in charge forever and ever, limiting the FBI's director appointment to 10 years. Obama went to Congress and got them to change it and got Mueller an extra 2 years. So he was director for 12 years, longer than anybody else except for J. Edgar Hoover. That was the first thing. Then he was brought back in to run to be special counsel, run the investigation of the Russian collusion after Trump had fired Comey, that's in May in 2017. And then that went on and on and on. Well, it was a lot of his staffers that really ran that, we now know, because when he finally made his one appearance afterwards before a congressional committee, it was clear the man, and this happens to men and women as they get very older, he had clearly lost his marbles. I mean, that's colloquial, but that's what happened.
And he allegedly, I mean, the reporting is that because he just got subpoenaed by the House Oversight Committee, he allegedly is in a memory care facility at present?
I believe so. And we would have known, and his wife and his family should have done everything they can to keep him, for his own personal embarrassment, to keep him from testifying that one time when he got up there and he said he never heard of some of the things that were just major components of the Russian collusion hoax, such as the Steele dossier, and then he denied he ever heard of the law firm that Hillary Clinton used. I mean, he just was fumbling. It was pathetic.
Well, so was he set up to be the patsy there and to let the partisan killers like Andrew Weissman run the show for the purpose of getting their target?
Most people think Weissman was the key guy.
Yeah,
without a doubt. But the truth of the matter is, and this should not be lost sight of, in spite of all of that, the Mueller report concluded that there was no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russians. They concluded that. They also did say that the Russians attempted to interfere. Now, they attempted to interfere, not necessarily, now this is my interpretation, not necessarily to help Trump, but to discredit our whole democratic process. And they've done that on numerous occasions in the past and since then. The Russians believed, and this is clear in the Durham report, the Russians believed, as did most everybody else, that Hillary Clinton would be the winner. So they knew they were facing Hillary as the next president, and they wanted to get some dirt and mud on her. And that's what it was aimed at, discrediting her and discrediting our electoral process.
Yeah, but what was well, I get that, but what was the aim of Mueller and the team after that didn't come to pass clearly, and Trump was in office? Was it, even with their sort of, even with their no evidence of collusion, they still gave enough wiggle room for professional prevaricators like Adam Schiff to go out there and say, well, that's not what they said, and we parsed over words for months and months on end, and it had already been emblazoned upon the minds of half of America that Trump was a Russian asset of Putin and so forth. So what was their aim? They knew they didn't have anything. They know they couldn't sustain an impeachment, or at least an impeachment and a conviction. They knew they couldn't sustain criminal charges. So they just wanted to extend this as long as they could, to hamstring it as long as they could, to bloody him bloody him up as much as they could. Was that it?
Well, Don, you have a lot of that recitation there. You have a lot of that correct. That's just about what did happen. And Mueller just couldn't bring himself to totally exonerate, in his own words, Trump, or the Trump campaign, as they were calling it. And Bill Barr, the Attorney General at the time, and the Deputy Attorney General, they called Mueller in. They called him up and they said, what is this? Why, if you say there's nothing to say that there was collusion, because they said there was no collusion, but then they wouldn't say that there was no obstruction on Trump's.
Right.
And Barr challenged him on that, and he just wouldn't say that, but he didn't find any evidence of it. And Barr made a point of saying this is just not the way we do business in the DOJ traditionally. And so you have it right. I mean, it's a quandary, but already, and it was very unlike Mueller. Mueller was a very hands-on person when he was FBI director, and apparently when he was a U.S. attorney in two different posts. Of people who dealt with him, and I know one or two, said he's very hands-on. I mean, this whole thing at the end of the Mueller report is just not his usual behavior. That's to contrast with Comey, who everybody who dealt with him describes him as being very hands-off, that he just floated above everything. Mueller traditionally had his hands on everything, and that's why Bill Barr was so disappointed in him.
The statement that Lee Smith made in that article I referenced at the outset, that the FBI has been protecting the Clintons for 25 years. What's your reaction to that statement?
Well, it's a little bit of hyperbole, but the FBI does have a long history with the Clintons, and you go back to a director who I know personally and greatly admire, Louis Freeh. His whole time as director, he made a point of staying away from Clinton because the whole time he was director, President Bill Clinton was under investigation for 2 or 3 different things, one after the other. Most of them are very well known now. And Louis Freeh made it a point to keep his distance from him, and even the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, she also made it a point, and this is not as well known, to keep her distance from Clinton. She didn't even answer his phone calls, and he's the President of the United States. Of course, she didn't want to pick up the phone and be told she was fired. And that's the truth. So, yeah, there's a long history there, but it's not always. And the New York office of the FBI was deeply involved in the investigation of the Clinton emails, and were very disappointed with the soft approach that Comey was taking, and very upset with Comey's quote unquote exoneration of Hillary at one point.
What is your take on the Epstein files, and the client list that does or does not exist? You obviously saw this week the House Oversight Committee issued subpoenas related to Epstein files for both Clintons, for Merrick Garland, for Jim Comey, for Bill Barr, for Alberto Gonzales, Jeff Sessions, Bob Mueller. I don't know about that. Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Attorney General Eric Holder. So like the last 4 or 5 attorneys general, as well as the Clintons and the former FBI director. What do you think that will produce? What do you think about the handling of the Epstein case and how this is shaking out?
Well, as you said in your opening, the handling of it initially, it was quite frankly and sadly mishandled by a number of people. You went through them in the current administration early on. They raised the expectations of the public, and now that it's being looked at the old cases, and of course there's several cases. There's the Florida case that he was pled guilty on and got a light sentence. Mm-hmm. Then there's the New York investigation that was underway, and then there's quite an extensive investigation of his death. And Bill Barr was Attorney General then, and Bill Barr was very upset with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which comes directly under him, that his death was allowed to happen. And of course, it led to speculation. Was he murdered? Did he commit suicide? He should have never been allowed to commit suicide. And that was Barr's conclusion. But now there's so much paper was created in those 3 investigations. And I have no doubt that dozens of people, hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 people were interviewed overall, almost all of whom were probably innocent. And it's the Department of Justice just can't go out and make all this public and besmirch a lot of people who just happen to have done financial dealings with Epstein or been at a party at Palm Beach or somewhere else with 1,000 other people with Epstein. They've put themselves in a terrible position. And this negotiating with this quite despicable woman, Maxwell, is really going nowhere because Maxwell still hasn't admitted her own guilt. So you can't make a deal or get somebody to testify against others, which is obviously what the aim of interviewing Maxwell was, if she won't admit her own guilt. So it's a terribly difficult corner they've painted themselves into.
Yeah, but I still, just from a very basic perspective, I just don't really understand if the reporting was accurate that there were estimates between 200 and 500 girls that were victimized. How and you have obviously victims who have come forward, including testifying at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. I don't understand how you can't wrap this up. All these victims, identifying individuals. There had to be more than just Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and why this is so mysterious. I don't understand how the pieces cannot be put together if all of those raw materials that have been reported are true.
Well, some of the pieces can be put together, and maybe should be, and maybe this is where the Congress will have a role because they operate under a different set of rules and guidelines than the DOJ. Now, just step back for a second, and you may remember the big scandal not too many years ago with the gymnast being abused by the Dr. NASA in Michigan. Right.
Yeah, that was mishandled, right.
And it was terribly mishandled. And ultimately, the Senate had hearings on it, and the gymnast very bravely, and 1 or 2 of them very well-known athletes now, came forward and testified in great detail about this. but that was voluntary on their part. These 200 women or young women or girls at the time who allegedly have been abused by Maxwell and Epstein and their buddies. You don't want to, as a society, put them through more hell. But I'm not sure, but it's quite likely, just like the gymnast, there's probably a dozen or a half dozen of them who'd be willing to come forward at this point and speak to Congress.
Yeah, who probably want to affect some justice, right?
So that may happen. That may happen. But it, as we both agree, it was mishandled initially, and the guy was a terrible guy. Maxwell's a terrible person herself.
Well, yeah.
So
yeah.
It's a terrible situation. But I think what is more hopeful is on the first issue we were talking about in this interview is the investigation of Comey and Brennan. I think that will get a lot of information out there, at least for the historians, if not for conviction.
Quickly before we let you go, that's what everybody wants to know. You've got some perspective on this. Do you think Comey is ultimately criminally prosecuted?
I don't know. If the things they could get him with specificity on might be if there were false statements or leaking. There was a lot leaked at different points, and since then, within the statute of limitations, there's been leaks to the press. Those are possibilities. But I think it's important to get the facts out there, which they can through a grand jury. They can, have what they call a talking indictment that lays out the whole story, because it's important for historians. Because I think that's where we're at now, to get this correct on the historical record that Comey and Brennan were reckless partisans who led this country into this turmoil, and get the record corrected. I think that's the best we can hope for here.
Thomas Baker, retired FBI special agent and legal attaché, author of The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Thomas Baker, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And Thomas Baker joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line. Thank you all for joining us on this edition of Chicago's Morning Answer. I'm off tomorrow, but I'll be back on Monday, so have a good weekend, all. It is now 9 a.m. on AM 560 WIND Chicago.